Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello, are you feeling bright and sunny with this calendula topic we're going to talk about today?
I am because they're the early birds to my farm. They're early and they're bright color. And yeah, let's think about and talk about calendula. And I have a love-hate relationship with calendula, and that's probably what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes, yes.
Some of those reasons behind that. But before we jump in, friends, just a reminder that you are invited over to thegardenersworkshop.com and you'll just find a fully stocked garden shop, online library of courses, free resources, and a whole lot more over there. All right, Layne, let's talk calendula. What's up with that?
Well, we got a listener request for an episode, and they had a lot of questions about not necessarily about how to grow calendula, but things like how early do they bloom? What else is blooming at that time? Are the stems too short to use? And how do you deal with the stickiness when you're harvesting?
Yeah.
So we'll just be going over a bunch of different questions like that.
Great. Let's jump in.
All right, so Calendula officinalis or pot marigolds are cool season hardy annuals that are typically winter hardy to USDA Zone 7. So the first question is, they're winter hardy in your zone, Lisa. So do you personally have success planting them in fall, very early spring, and beyond where you live in southeastern Virginia, USDA Zone 8A?
So during all those years that we were doing a bouquet program and selling to florists, we always called calendula the zinnia of spring. And that was because of the shape of the flower. It's very much a daisy-like flower. And that's one of the things that we were missing in our lineup of flowers, especially for making bouquets, until our sunflowers got started. And then, of course, zinnias would start. So calendula is just one of, I'm just trying to think, it is perhaps one of the earliest flowers to bloom on our farm. And we have good years and bad years. I am forecasting that this is not going to be a great year because we've had a really tough winter, just meaning really low temps and a lot of fluctuation, which tends to torture them a little bit. Because they're early birds, they can be teased into trying to bloom early. And I mean, you can just cut those blooms all the way back like you would like you were cutting it. But sometimes the plants just give up, after
Yes.
that kind of behavior. And so we do plant them in the fall, and we can and we are this year planting them again in very early spring. However, our fall planted is by far the best quality. They're the earliest to bloom and they have the tallest stems. The year that we were shooting for my book, Vegetables Love Flowers, we had the most amazing stand of calendula. We actually had like probably a 30 or 40-foot bed, which normally I would never grow that much of it for reasons that we'll talk about later, I'm sure. But because of photography and it is such a strong pollinator plant and useful in other things, I grew a lot. And when you grow a lot of something, you learn a lot of what they need. And so we learned that year that the fall planted definitely had, I mean, we were getting 24 to 30-inch stems on flowers that I had never gotten. What caused that? Well, it was they were well established, right? Because they were fall planted, but the conditions that year were just conducive. Mild winters really helped them along very much. We are planting in very early spring, and I have done that before, but it is likely that we will have shorter stems. That is the result of them not being as well established when it comes time for them to bloom because they are early season bloomers. Just think if they're supposed to be blooming 2 months from now and you plant them now, they barely get rooted in and they have to start performing, right? So something has to give, and usually it's the abundance and the stem length that gives that. And whether or not you plant beyond that time would 100% depend on your conditions. If you live in New England or in Montana, you can probably grow this very early spring and then plant it again because you don't have perhaps the hot, humid conditions that we have that they just aren't very happy with.
Okay, moving on to the next question. And this is about timing and the ability to make early spring mixed bouquets. Lisa, your last expected frost date is typically around April 15th. So, how early do calendula bloom for you when they're fall planted in your garden? And what else is blooming at that time typically?
So this is an image, and I will invite you, if you're listening to this on a podcast, Layne puts together a beautiful slideshow of what we're talking about so you can get more of an idea. We're looking at an early blooming, that is Ivory Princess, I believe.
Yes.
And oftentimes, because you get discouraged, first off, we're so hungry for blooms in early spring. Oftentimes, the first blooms are pretty short, as these are. You see that I have them netted because we know that the potential is that they're going to grow taller and then go down in a rainstorm. So for us, typically the first blooms start happening the end of March into April. April is really calendula's month, and then into May, depending again if it doesn't get really hot and humid, and if it's a moist spring, that is like made for calendula. That's when we get really the best stem length and those blooms. And the other early bloomers in my garden are typically bachelor buttons, which are another just really early bird, agrostemma. Sometimes the bells of Ireland are tall enough to be able to like be a backbone of a bouquet. But generally for us, what we learned through the years, it didn't matter. In the middle of winter, you can fool yourself. But when spring comes, the reality is there just aren't many flowers in the early season. There are some. If you're selling to florists, you have stuff to make bunches out of to deliver to somebody. But to make mixed bouquets and have enough flowers that really fill it up, spring bouquets, you just keep adding stems and adding stems and adding stems, but your bouquet does not seem to get any bigger. And that's just the nature of spring flowers unless you take steps to have something. And for us, Bells of Ireland and Bupleurum were always great fillers. And so there's not a lot to go along with calendula. But we were so hungry for bright colors and a daisy-like flowers, we always gambled that it would be a good year for calendula.
Yeah. And it's also great for home gardeners. Maybe they're not even trying to use them in bouquets. It's a great one out in the garden to have an early flower out there to enjoy visually, but also to support pollinators.
Yes, and we'll talk about the stickiness, I know, here in
Yes.
just a moment, right? But it is an excellent pollinator plant. And this is like, everybody kills the dandelions in the yard, right? I mean, the calendulas really fill in that same window of the first foods for pollinators that you can provide in your landscape, in your vegetable garden, to really bring them in and to get that colony of good guys established in your garden.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Due to their shorter stem length, do you find calendula usable in mixed bouquets or are they better all by themselves? And in your experience, do florists tend to request them? Are they an in-demand item?
It really depends on your customers. First off, if they're tall enough to use in mixed bouquets, we would use them out of desperation. But, just like sweet peas, their base life is not like all the other flowers, typically, especially cool flowers in the spring. So many of them last so long. Um, that calendula, you're lucky to get 5 days out of it, even with all the proper conditioning steps, right? So if I did use them in bouquets out of desperation, we would only put one or two, for it to have that pop of just maybe a focal flower or that pop of bright color. And again, for florist, the event work for table work is where calendula really fills the bill. Table work meaning those little, not mason jars. I mean, florists don't typically use mason jars. They use those little cubes. And if they're doing a lot of tables early on, and if they're one of your customers that's a believer in local flowers, they love the first flowers just like we do. They're hungry, right? And that's where calendula could play a role. I had a customer that actually did tons of weddings, they did tons of table work, they did big weddings, and they were always happy to have those local flowers that doesn't matter that they're only 12 inches because they're going to cut them down to 7 inches anyway, so it
Yeah.
worked out really well.
How tall are your calendula stems typically when you have fall planted them?
Um, Usually 18 to 20 inches is, a reality. 24 on really great years, but shorter sometimes. And as I've mentioned, sometimes the first flush can be short, but just cut them. Be sure they're getting their nutrition and water, proper moisture. And it's very likely that the additional coming stems will get taller and they do just continue to produce as long as you cut them.
And again, for home gardeners, and I know you love to do this too, Lisa, a little vase, like you mentioned, just with calendula in it is so cheerful and it's so welcome at that time of year early in the spring.
Yes. And speaking of little sweet vases of flowers, I have to show you something. And if y'all are listening to us on a podcast, you have to pop over to YouTube to look at this. So I start a lot of seedlings for demonstration, right? Because I teach and video and all that stuff. So we started extra feverfew this last fall. Actually, September 19th is the date on this tray. We had a whole tray of the single feverfew, my personal favorite of the feverfews, and I just never ditched them. So these seedlings have been in the grow room under grow lights growing, and y'all, they're now blooming. And I
Ah,
have this sweetest little vase of feverfew. I literally harvested the tray of soil blocks.
oh my
And just like calendula, it's the foliage, just the fragrance of the foliage. My husband and I talk about and look at this little vase on our kitchen table, where our dining room table, where we eat all of our meals all the time. So
God.
yeah, those early calendula are almost like a little rescue program for us.
I love your little vase of feverfew. And I actually had that happen last year with a tray of gomphrena that I somehow forgot about that were hardening off. And they did go on to bloom in soil blocks,
It's
three-quarter inch soil blocks.
amazing.
It is. Now we're on to our final question. How sticky is calendula foliage? Do the stems make the vase water murky? And do you have any tips or tricks for harvesting and conditioning them?
So that foliage is nectar, and that's the foliage excretes that. I mean, it's the same with any sticky plant in the garden, and that's why it is such a valuable pollinator plant, because it feeds pollinators even before it blooms, and that is really, really significant. Um, and we use the CVBN tablets, which is the pre-treatment that's in the harvest buckets that kills any bacteria growth, which comes from stems dumping ooziness out of their stem. And yeah, calendulas definitely are in the dirty dozen. They contribute to that. So we pre-treat them, which slows that down and just kind of lengthens their life from doing that. And so when I am harvesting calendula, you would never attempt it without gloves. I mean, we wear gloves, those Nitrile Touch Atlas gloves that we love. We use gloves to do everything out in the garden, but I especially wear gloves when I'm doing calendula. And we just strip them all. And if I go to do something after I've harvested calendula with those gloves and they're sticky, I just go change them because we just rinse them off. So we cut deep and cut hard. If they're blooming short, wait till the weather starts to get warming a little bit, which means the stems will start to grow. Just cut it where you would cut to make the cut as a cut flower, which is all the way at ground level, and that'll stimulate more stems to come. And we always harvest them into CVBN and then the normal process. Then they go home with fresh flower food. And you also want to be sure to harvest them into a container that fits the stems, meaning don't take a wide container out there and put just a few stems in because they'll slide. They're kind of if you want your stems to be as stiff as possible, keep them upright and straight. Use CVBN, and if you have to, use a splash of the Quick Dip, which will also help. That's an instant hydrator that just helps them get water really quick. Um, and then they just get flower food when they go in a vase, and they do pretty well. Last year, I think Is that Ivory Princess Lane on the left?
Yes, it is.
I think that was maybe from 2 years ago. One year we had such an amazing, I think it's probably the Vegetables Love Flowers shoot. That year I had more calendula in my house because not only were they abundant, when they were so abundant, guess what else I learned? They lasted longer in the vase. That was just a healthier stem, and they were so absolutely, they just don't look real. They just don't look real.
They don't. And I think when most people think of calendula, they think of the orange and yellow or gold colors, but there are also creamy ivories, apricot and peach tones, bronzes. There's just a lot to choose from, and they're all so gorgeous and such a welcome addition in the home or in the garden.
And I think they grow great in containers. So if you had a large container, again, that whole large thing, it would be just a pleasant surprise to have them start blooming. And it just is so great that native bees and the parasitic wasps, all the good guys that you want to invite to your garden are drawn in earlier. And this is one of the invitations that you can use.
Yeah, that is the best part. And by the way, we do have an entire episode on conditioning flowers, which was episode 95. So if you want to know a little more about the whole process and the products that are used to condition flowers, you can go check out episode 95. Okay, well, that wraps up our episode on some calendula questions. If you have any additional questions, you can always leave a comment over on YouTube or use the form linked in the show notes to submit a question. And just thank you so much for being here. If you want to learn more about how to grow calendula from seed, from sowing, growing, all the way through harvesting with actual video demonstrations, remember that Lisa and I have our course, Cool Flowers from Seed to Harvest. It's an online on-demand course that you can access from anywhere with an internet connection on your computer or your phone. So be sure to check that out. I'll link that in the show notes as well. And just thank you again for joining us.
All right, friends, until we meet again, ciao.
Bye.